Does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 491, I call up Senate Joint Resolution 36 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
Senate Joint Resolution 36, Joint Resolution providing for congressional disapproval of the proposed transfer to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Kingdom of Spain, and the Italian Republic of certain defense articles and services.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the joint resolution is considered read. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Mr. Speaker, during consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include in the record extraneous materials on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the 3 measures the House will now consider are extraordinary. Extraordinary but necessary because they respond to what I view as an extraordinary abuse of power by the Trump administration using a phony emergency to override the authority of Congress and push through $8 billion in arms sales. Each of these resolutions would prohibit a specific license for the export of precision-guided munitions or smart bombs and related components. We are focusing on these 3 licenses because the weapons would be the first ones shipped. Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that Congress has serious concerns about the Saudi-led coalition's war in Yemen. The Saudis and their partners, and for that matter the United States, do have legitimate security concerns about the efforts of Iran and its proxies to destabilize the Gulf region. But as this war has dragged on, it's become clear that the coalition has carried out its campaign with little regard for innocent life. School buses full of children destroyed in a fiery flash, weddings and funerals incinerated with no warning, civilian buildings and communities targeted. Reckless doesn't begin to describe it. It's gruesome. It's contributed to the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. To make matters worse, many of the weapons used in this carnage were built in America, sold by American companies to the Saudis and their partners. Starting in the last Congress, when the administration told us they were planning to go ahead with another massive sale of offensive weapons to the Saudis and Emiratis, Senator Menendez and I used the tools at our disposal to place informal holds on these transfers. We hoped that the administration would work with us and dial up pressure on these nations to start acting responsibly. Now, the administration has complained that we stopped these sales from going through for months and months. But as I said, this was an informal mechanism. The law, and I emphasize it's the law, and it says that at any point if an administration wants to go ahead with a weapons sale, it has to send a formal notification to Congress. That starts a 30-day clock. During that time, Congress can vote to stop a weapons sale. Should the administration approach us to try to find a way forward? No. Did they send a formal notification starting the process laid out in the law under which Congress can legislatively block the sale? No. What did they do? They dug up an obscure provision of the arms export law and declared an emergency to justify moving ahead with these sales. What does that mean? It means they went around Congress. It means they went around the law. Now the emergency provision does exist in law for a good reason. And if there were a real emergency, if the United States or our citizens or our allies were in immediate danger, we wouldn't be standing here today. There would be no objection. But here's the thing, Mr. Speaker. There is no emergency. Do you know how I know? I know because nearly 2 months down the line, not a single weapon has been shipped. Most of the weapons haven't even been built. In fact, one of the phony emergency declarations lets the Saudis build new facilities to manufacture weapons in their country, which I only presume would mean the Americans currently building these weapons in the United States would be out of a job. That's right. Donald Trump declared an emergency to move jobs out of the United States, good manufacturing jobs, the kind Americans fight for, he abused the law to send them abroad. What kind of emergency requires weapons that will be built months and months down the road, or requires building a new factory on foreign soil, especially when the law only gives Congress a 30-day review period? The answer is clear, Mr. Speaker: a phony emergency. An emergency designed to make yet another end run around Congress, to undermine the separation of powers, to trample on this body's constitutional duties. I'm sick and tired of it, Mr. Speaker. The State Department sent an Assistant Secretary up to the Hill to testify about this fiasco. He told us in the Foreign Affairs Committee that the administration took this brazen action out of respect for Congress's oversight role. Mr. Speaker, that's really, really hard to believe. The other body passed 22 bipartisan resolutions stopping all these sales from going forward. The three measures we're considering today deal with weapons that are already manufactured, sitting in a warehouse, and if we don't act, will be loaded onto a ship and sent to Saudi Arabia and the UAE within the next 2 months. This resolution would prohibit the use of an emergency declaration to move ahead with the transfer of 64,000 paveway precision-guided munitions, or as we call them, smart bombs. 64,000, Mr. Speaker, which would be added to the stockpile of 58,000 the Saudis previously purchased starting in 2015. What will all of these weapons be used for? No one knows. If the administration wants to sell these weapons, they should follow the law, not misuse it, and they should come to Congress for its approval. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized. Mr. McCall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in a strong opposition to this dangerous resolution. Right now, as I speak, Iran is stretching its tentacles of terror across the Middle East. And by aiding the Houthis in Yemen, arming Hezbollah in Lebanon, and supporting the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, Iran is creating a Shia crescent that can dominate the region. Their goal is to build a strategic land bridge from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea. And if we allow them to succeed, terrorism will flourish, instability will reign, and the security of our allies like Israel will be threatened. One of the ways we can push back against Iran's murderous aggression is by empowering our partners in the region. Unfortunately, this irresponsible resolution handcuffs our ability to do so. Specifically, this legislation would prohibit an export license and stop the United States from providing our partners with the arms that they need to defend themselves. This particular license first came before members of the Foreign Affairs Committee in January of 2018. When I became the lead Republican in January of 2019, I reviewed this case and maintained the informal approval granted by my predecessor, Chairman Royce. The administration has been criticized for bypassing Congress to push these sales through, but the Democrats, in fairness, placed informal holds on this sale for more than 13 months, a total of 407 days, which I believe abuses the process that we have in place in Congress. And during that time, the State Department continued to pursue this case with Congress. They also sent forward additional cases to help with the Saudis, the UAE, and Jordan. And by the time the State Department submits such cases to Congress, they've already undergone a thorough interagency review process. This important process ensures compliance with the President's conventional arms transfer policy intended to support our partners and strengthen our national security. Other critics are worried that these weapons will increase civilian casualties in Yemen. However, the precision-guided munitions that we are trying to send to the Saudis will actually lower the risk of civilian casualties in Yemen as it counters attacks from Iran-backed Houthis. Now is not the time to deny our partners what they need for their defense, nor is it time to withhold precision-guided munitions that can minimize the risk to civilians. Recently, after Iran attacked civilian ships and shot down one of our drones, a U.S. military asset, The President brought together a bipartisan group of congressional leaders, including the chairman and myself, to discuss an appropriate response. He listened to our advice and made a prudent decision to exercise restraint. The President has made it explicitly clear the United States is not looking for war. The decision to move forward with these arms sales is part of a larger effort to deter Iran. A key part of that effort is to empower a greater burden sharing by enhancing the defense capabilities of our allies. These sales provide more options for deterring Iran that do not all depend on U.S. intervention. I support these sales, even though I do not think that all 22 required emergency certification. And this is a point the chairman and I actually agree on, especially those that will not be ready for delivery until later this year. I support revising the law of Chairman Engel to ensure and enhance the role of Congress in future emergency sales. And I would like to thank the chairman for his bipartisan work with me on that amendment to the NDAA that was passed by a wide margin. But I do oppose relitigating prior lawful sales to partners who face growing threats to their security, which is what today's resolutions attempt to do. Mr. Speaker, we face many dynamic challenges. Iran threatens the Middle East. It continues to pursue the eradication of Israel, and it remains the #1 state sponsor of terrorism around the world. And that threat is growing, not waning. And for that reason, I believe that members should oppose today's resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
From Texas, reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 2.5 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support Senate Joint Resolution 36 and the other measures related to arms sales being considered this afternoon, which will prevent 3 sets of arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE without undergoing the proper congressional notification process. We're here today because rather than come and make their case to Congress, the administration invented a phony emergency to bypass the legal process for approving arms sales. There is no justification for this decision other than the administration knew that these sales would be met with scrutiny from Congress and didn't want to deal with it. Well, they were right. Congress is concerned about these proposed sales, and we should not sit back and allow the administration to continue with the charade of claiming an emergency exemption for them. I'm glad these measures of disapproval have bipartisan support and have already passed the Republican-led Senate. I urge all of my colleagues to support them today. The administration briefed this body on Iran just days before the supposed emergency was declared and never mentioned any emergency. We're supposed to believe that within a matter of days, the situation escalated so quickly that they were forced to bypass Congress. Most of the weapons, including the emergency sales, are offensive weapons, and much of the sale will be delivered months or years from now. Further evidence that no emergency exists. The egregious and legally questionable move to put more weapons into the hands of regimes who are responsible for perpetrating horrific civilian casualties in Yemen comes as no surprise from an administration that has cozied up to the Saudi Crown Prince, even as we have credible evidence that he and his government are responsible for the cold-blooded murder of an American resident and journalist. Just because you don't like the process doesn't mean you get to ignore it. This action has implications far beyond the current sale, and if Congress doesn't reassert our proper role in the process, we risk giving up the authority in arms sales processes entirely. This isn't and shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's our job as Congress to represent the American people in matters of war, and if we let this action go without a strong congressional response, the repercussions will be wide-ranging and long-standing. I urge my colleagues to support these resolutions of disapproval and block these arms sales once and for all. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Rhode Island yields the balance of the time. Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller.
Gentleman from West Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to speak in opposition to Senate Joint Resolution 36. This legislation is bad policy, and it sets a bad precedent. Today, Congress is attempting to block legal U.S. arms sales to strategic partners who face increased threats from Iran and terrorist proxies. The administration is ensuring that our allies in the Middle East have the capabilities to defend themselves and protect the hundreds of thousands of Americans who live and work in the Gulf states. These allies depend on military equipment from the U.S. to hold the line against Iran, al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other threats. If we don't supply it, they will buy it elsewhere. Russian arms dealers are already seeking to exploit the reluctance. At this point in history, we need to do what we can to decrease Iran's influence in the region. I urge my colleagues to vote against the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger.
Gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of SJ Resolution 36, a joint resolution which I am leading in the House. The evidence is clear. The Saudi government continues to disregard the vital distinction between combatants and innocent civilians in Yemen. In February, Congress voted to end U.S. support to the Saudi-led campaign against the Houthis that has left thousands of civilians dead and created one of the largest humanitarian crises in modern times. However, the President not only vetoed our resolution, but the administration is now ramping up support for Saudi Arabia's offensive actions in Yemen, while simultaneously escalating tensions with Iran. As I made clear during Foreign Affairs Committee hearings in May, not only is the administration trying to sell the Saudis more powerful weapons, but we are giving them the opportunity to build their own. With this latest proposal, the administration would be transferring sensitive technology that would allow Saudi Arabia to manufacture these high-tech weapons directly. Congress needs to reassert its authority now as a co-equal branch of government. This resolution, which I have led in the House, would make sure that blatantly offensive weapons aren't sold to the Saudi military under the guise of defensive uses without congressional review. I am proud to work with my colleagues in the Senate to block the sale of precision-guided munitions, which are responsible for some of the most horrific examples of targeted attacks against civilians. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand up against this misguided decision, protect innocent lives, and reassert the authority of Congress. I reserve the balance of my time, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves.
No, prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
I reserve for the purposes of closing.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to go back to when we debated the Yemen resolution, which I thought was once again pro-Iran and pro-Houthi rebel and anti-Israel. And it's interesting, after that passed this chamber, that the Houthi rebels celebrated a victory in the Congress, thinking that the American people, through the Congress, actually supported them. We have to be responsible in our rhetoric on this floor and what we stand for. Many in this body favor asking our partners around the world to step up and do more to help protect our shared interests. The President has called on other nations to take on the burden of defeating terrorism in the Middle East and has commended our partners for their contributions to regional security. Sharing this burden of collective security interests is really vital to ensuring the United States is not the only one bearing the costs in blood and treasure, for we have borne way too much in the Middle East. But these arms sales are where the rubber hits the road for burden sharing. We cannot ask our partners to take on additional burdens while withholding from them the tools to do so. We should and do work with our partners to train them to use U.S. origin equipment effectively and responsibly. This is an ongoing process. My fear is that if we are unwilling to provide our partners with the means to ensure their own security and to invest their resources to turn them into responsible users, then the United States will find itself as a main guarantor of Middle East security that we have bared the burden for the last several decades. We also need to be wary of our partners turning to China and Russia for their defense needs. So, Mr. Speaker, it was unfortunate how the current law, I believe, was utilized for these 22 sales. That's where Chairman and Engel and I agree. And that is why we've worked on a bipartisan basis to refine this process for invoking an emergency moving forward. And we have the informal congressional review process to resolve concerns regarding sales. But when members place indefinite holds on sales and place a stop to one ability to share burdens with our partners for 18 months in some cases, it undermines our entire security strategy and the important bilateral partnerships we have worked so hard to establish and grow. For that reason, I oppose the resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
May I ask how much time I have?
Gentleman has 1 minute remaining.
Okay, then I yield myself the remainder of my time to close debate on this measure. I'll wrap up quickly as we have two more of these measures to consider. It's important that we pass this measure now, along with the two we'll soon consider, because these deal with the weapons that could soon be on their way across the ocean. Look, I think the Iranian regime is dangerous. I think the Houthis are dangerous. No one is denying the Saudis the right to go after them. What we're saying is don't go after them and kill thousands of civilians in the process with American weapons. And also separation of powers. The President cannot try to get around Congress with phony emergencies. And I yield back. I urge a yes vote.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 491. The previous question ordered on the joint resolution. The question is on the third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution provided for congressional disapproval of the proposed transfer to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, the Kingdom of Spain, and the Italian Republic of certain defense articles and services.
The question is on the passage of the joint resolutions. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The joint resolution is passed without objection. The motion from Texas.
Mr. Speaker, on that, I request the yeas and the nays.
Gentleman from Texas has requested the yeas and nays. Those in favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 491, I call up Senate Joint Resolution 37 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
Senate Joint Resolution 37, joint resolution providing for congressional disapproval of the proposed export to the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Republic of France of certain defense articles and services.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the joint resolution is considered read. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Illinois, each will control 10 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, during consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include in the record extraneous materials on the measure under consideration.
Without objection.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized. Mr. Engel.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. The second resolution we're debating is very similar to the first, but in this case, it would nullify the administration's phony emergency being used to transfer 60,000 precision-guided bombs to the United Arab Emirates. That's on top of the 40,000 we estimate the Emiratis already have on hand. I won't rehash the same argument, but I would like to make a point why, when we see what's going on in Yemen, it's so important for the United States to take a stand. Mr. Speaker, one of the things the Foreign Affairs Committee has focused on this year is trying to put American values back at the center of our foreign policy: democracy, human rights, the rule of law. Frankly, this administration has acted like it cannot be burdened with these fundamental things that make America America. It just boggles the mind. Any great country can throw its weight around, but we're not China. We're not Russia. Our foreign policy should show the world the character of our country, our compassion, our belief that people everywhere should be able to live prosperously, productively, and have healthy lives. These ideas go hand in hand with promoting our security. We want more stable, secure countries and communities. Democratic countries are stronger partners for the United States on the world stage. And if we're serious about those values, it means speaking out when we see them trampled, whether they're trampled by an adversary or by a friend. When we turn our back on these ideals, when we strip the word democracy out of the State Department's mission statement, when we look the other way when friendly regimes carry out horrific human rights abuses, when we slash investments in diplomacy and development efforts that help us build bridges of friendship and understanding, when we walk away from all that, what signal does it send to the world? What does it say about the sort of behavior that we're willing to tolerate? I've supported our partners and our partnerships in the Gulf region. I think they're an important counterbalance to the threat Iran poses. And I recognize that our partners face real threats from Iranian-backed Houthis who are themselves guilty of serious human rights abuses. But that doesn't mean we should just look the other way in the face of violence and slaughter of civilians perpetrated by our partners. It doesn't mean we look the other way and let the President ride roughshod over Congress, and so there's no separation of powers. Whatever the President wants, he gets, and Congress just rubber stamps it. Can't be that way. So even if this administration will not stand up for the values, the Congress should, and the Congress will. These measures, along with much of the Foreign Affairs Committee's work this year, sends a strong message that our values must guide our foreign policy. So again, it's important for us to help Saudi Arabia. It's important to realize Iran is making trouble. It's important to know that the Houthis are not good people. But it doesn't mean that we give Saudi Arabia or any other country a blank check to do whatever they want, dropping bombs indiscriminately on school children, on buses. We can't just sit idly by and let that happen and continue to send weapons that are perpetrating these crimes. So this is a strong message, I think, that our values must guide our foreign policy, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kinsinger, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a quick point on that. We don't like when innocent people are bombed, and when we look at Yemen, I think it's really incumbent on us to see what's happening. A legitimate government in Yemen was overthrown by Iranian-supported rebels, and Iran that has not sent $1 of humanitarian aid to support the people that have been killed. And what we're talking about in this specific resolution is actually UAE. So I rise in opposition to SJ Res 37. Since the emergency declaration to expedite arms sales to the Saudi-led coalition to defeat the Houthi rebels, Congress has debated the President's exercise of the emergency clause of the Arms Export Control Act. This joint resolution of disapproval, along with 21 other JRDs, intends to stop transfers to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan. SJ Res 37 specifically blocks the transfer of paveway precision-guided munitions to the United Arab Emirates. This technology converts dumb bombs, like the ones used by Russia to kill innocent men, women, and children in Syria, into precision-guided munitions, ones that are intended to avoid civilian casualties. And we can debate whether shipments that aren't ready to be delivered require an emergency declaration, but at the end of the day, some of the munitions that we are discussing today have already left the shores of the United States and are en route to the UAE. In fact, the first tranche is en route now, and the second tranche will be leaving in September. Mr. Speaker, this JRD and the two up for debate today are not about timelines for shipment. What we have heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle argue that these arms could be used in Yemen to target civilians. Yet there are reports that the UAE has already withdrawn from Yemen. The UAE serves as a bulwark against Iranian aggression, the ongoing threat of al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups wishing to harm the United States, our allies, and our interests. In contrast, the Iranian-backed Houthis, through missiles and UAV strikes, are a threat to stability in the region. Iran and the forces it supports, like the Houthis, are a threat to our national security and the security of our allies. They are the #1 contributor to human suffering in Yemen, the #1 contributor. We've seen the Iranian regime threaten international shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, including ships belonging to the UK, Japan, and Norway. They've shot down an expensive American military asset flying in international airspace. Prior to the president's emergency declaration, the head of Iran's Quds Force called on terror groups to prepare for a proxy war with the United States and our allies. Since then, we've seen proxies be emboldened in their actions. Yet we are here today debating arms sales to the UAE on the basis that these arms transfers may be used by our strategic ally in Yemen. While there's no guarantee that these weapons will ever be used in Yemen, will ever not be used in Yemen either, there are facts that show exactly why we must continue to provide these arms to the UAE. As a former Air Force pilot and a current pilot in the Air Guard, I'm proud that our government would not send our Air Force to fly sorties without munitions needed to defend themselves. Similarly, we should not have an ally flying our F-16s without the necessary tools it needs to complete its mission. The Iranians have shown that they have the capacity and ability to fire upon military aircraft with no regard for whether the platform is manned or unmanned. When our allies are in a dogfight, we can't leave them without the means to defend themselves and our shared interests. And I also want to point out there's a lot of discussion about offensive or defensive weapons. A bomb can be used defensively or offensively. I can't think of many weapons that are actually defensive in nature because they are used to destroy an enemy. So it's all about how you employ that weapon. Saying that we want to send only defensive weapons shows our allies to be weak against an Iran that has shown that it wants to go on the offensive continually. And I can name basically every country in the Middle East and show Iranian influences there. On the broader picture, we have got to debate how this went out. I fully agree with everybody on that. But we cannot leave our allies in a lurch. We cannot leave them unprotected because our big chief enemy is Iran. I know there's broad-based agreement on that, and we cannot show weakness in the eyes of that. With that, Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance.
Gentleman from Illinois reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, a senior member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and thank him for his leadership on this and many other issues. And I rise today in opposition to SJ Resolution 37, which would prevent the transfer of paveway precision-guided missiles munitions to the United Arab Emirates. There are numerous reasons to oppose this resolution. Let me list three. First, and most obviously, some paveways have already left the U.S., and this fact alone shows that this resolution is more about messaging than action and demonstrates the urgent need the UAE has for these munitions. Second, the UAE is a steadfast partner against Iran. Tehran is our foremost opponent in the region right now and a critical threat to our interests there. And I would note that the very flawed Iran deal put millions, in fact billions and billions of dollars in cash into the pockets of Iran, and they're now using those dollars to support terrorism, to foment instability, to put mines on ships and attack ships in international waters. So they're now a threat not just in the region, but a threat around the world. So thank God President Trump had the good sense to get us out of that terrible deal. If we want the UAE's continued help, we need to ensure that we are a reliable partner and that they are properly armed. And the third item is that the U.S. needs to continue its leadership in the region. If the UAE and Saudi Arabia cannot buy arms from us, that doesn't mean they won't get arms. It just means that they'll buy them from the Russians. This will diminish our standing, weaken our leverage with our partners, and call into question our reliability as a partner. For these reasons and really others, I urge my colleagues to oppose this resolution. I thank the gentleman for yielding and yield back my time.
Gentleman from Ohio yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Illinois reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Is the gentleman prepared to close?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. I yield myself the remainder of the time.
Gentleman is recognized.
Well, thanks again, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend on the other side of the aisle, and it's a good debate here. But bottom line on this, I think if the concern is Saudi Arabia, I understand the concern. I may not share it in the same level of depth, but then vote no on the last resolution or vote for the last resolution. This one's on UAE. And whether it's Saudi, UAE, or Jordan, I think it's important for us, Mr. Speaker, to constantly show that we have our allies back, especially an ally like UAE. We know that Iran likes to go on the offensive. We know that the only thing that stops Iran from broader encroachments in the Middle East is the United States and our allies. And we know that a good offensive posture is the best defensive posture to prevent a shooting war from ever happening. So again, we can all debate the process, how this went down. But the bottom line is we must reject this resolution. This is a resolution that I think is a result of political pressure, and we must send this back to the Senate where it belongs, or if this passes, I'm sure the President will veto it. So with that, Mr. Speaker, again, thank you for everybody in the debate, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, let me say I certainly respect my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for the points they raised. We have similar concerns, but I think the way we handle it, or way we propose to handle it, is a little bit different. And that's why I'm saying if we don't pass this measure, these bombs will be on their way to the Emirates very soon. If we do pass this resolution, it will go to the President's desk, and it will put him on the spot to answer whether he agrees that our values need to be central to America's work around the world. Again, I am very concerned and aware of the malign role that the Iranians play in the region. I am very concerned about the Houthis, who also play a bad role in the region. But that doesn't mean that we should just give blank checks or give arms. I think it would just be a mistake to let them think that they don't have to have any conduct in trying to conduct this war into diminishing civilian casualties. And the other point I want to raise again is the fact that remember when you were a kid in school and you learned how a bill became a law? Well, something called separation of powers, checks and balances. It's not right for the President to declare an emergency when there really is no emergency in order to get around Congress's disapproval of something. So I feel it's important to fight for the institution as well. So again, if we do pass this resolution, it'll go to the President's desk, and it'll let him answer whether he agrees that our values need to be central to our work around the world. So I thank my colleagues, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 491. The previous question is ordered on the joint resolution. The question is on the third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A resolution providing for congressional disapproval of the proposed export to the United Arab Emirates, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the Republic of France of certain defense articles and services.
The question is on the passage of the joint resolutions. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The joint resolution is. The gentleman from Illinois.
On that, I request the yeas and nays.
Gentleman from Illinois has requested the ayes and nays. Those favoring a vote by the ayes and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the ayes and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.
Thank you. Looks like Mr. Mast is going to do this one.
What state is it from? For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 491, I call up Senate Joint Resolution 38 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
Senate Joint Resolution 38, Joint Resolution providing for congressional disapproval of the proposed export to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland of certain defense articles and services.
Pursuant to House Resolution 491, the joint resolution is considered read. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, Each will control 10 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include in the record extraneous materials on the measure under consideration.
Without objection,
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This final measure we'll consider would stop the transfer of fuses for precision-guided munitions, critical components that allow these weapons to be armed and detonated. Like the bombs, these components have already been manufactured, and we need to act quickly to stop their shipment. As we wrap up this debate, Mr. Speaker, I want to make an appeal to my friends on the other side of the aisle. You can be for or against these weapons sales and still understand that these resolutions are the right thing to do, if nothing else, for the integrity of this body. I spoke earlier about the rule of law. This phony emergency declaration is a message to the Congress and to the American people that when the law gets in the way, this administration is just going to find a way around it. They'll twist the law into pretzels or just throw it out the window entirely if it allows them to sidestep Congress. We cannot stand for that. This administration should have played by the rules, and we could have done that and probably still gotten these sales through. They could have sent up a notification and allowed Congress to have a debate, but instead they want to shut us out of this process. With these resolutions, we're taking some of that power back. We're saying that we won't allow the laws written in this body to be ignored. If nothing else, this is an opportunity to stand up and say, we took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that means Congress remains a co-equal branch of government. Let me say that again. That means that Congress remains a co-equal branch of government. We will not be a rubber stamp for any administration, not only this administration, but any administration. Congress has its duties. We will not be a rubber stamp. I felt for a long time that administrations of both parties, frankly, have ignored Congress when it comes to foreign policy and national security. We shouldn't stand for it any longer. No more do we give a blank check to any president from any party who wants to cut Congress out of the decision-making and subvert the Constitution. So we shouldn't agree to it, we shouldn't stand for it, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of the time. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Masters, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I request I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman has been recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to SJ Res 38, and I want to focus my remarks on the rationale behind the President's emergency declaration and ask that we think about the definition of the word declaration, what that means to each of us. My friends on the other side of the aisle, they would prefer to forget that these arms sales were expedited for a very specific reason. They are omitting this information because it doesn't fit into their narrative that the President is doing a favor to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I can tell you that defense is no favor. The threat that emanates from Iran that precipitated this emergency declaration, it is very, very real. And as a result, so is the need for the weapons sales to our partners. So let's think about, are these situations emergencies? Do they pose an immediate risk to life, an immediate threat to life? In May, in the days leading right up to this emergency declaration, Iran and its proxies executed several attacks throughout the Middle East over just 2 weeks. 4 oil tankers were attacked in the Gulf of Oman. I would say that's an emergency and a threat to life. Armed drones struck Saudi oil fields. I would say that's an emergency and a threat to life. The head of the Quds Force called on terror groups to prepare for a proxy war. I would certainly call that an emergency and a very direct threat to life. A rocket was launched near the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. I would call that an emergency and a threat to life. A bomb-carrying drone was launched by Houthi rebels targeting a Saudi airport on May 21. I would say that is an emergency and a threat to life. Now, in the weeks Since the emergency declaration, Iran has only ramped up its attacks, and it's precipitating the need to have this emergency declaration. Houthi rebels have continued attacks on civilian airports in Saudi Arabia. That is an emergency and a direct threat to life. The IRGC perpetrated another attack on commercial shipping, this time targeting Japanese and Norwegian oil tankers transiting through the Straits of Hormuz. I would say that that is an emergency and a threat to life. A rocket hit an oil drilling site in Iraq's southern Basra province, striking inside a compound that housed contractor employees of ExxonMobil. I'd say that's an emergency and a threat to life. Iran shot down a U.S. military asset over international waters. I'd say that's an emergency. And just last week, 3 Iranian paramilitary vessels tried to impede the passage of a British oil tanker transiting the Straits of Hormuz. And I would say that is an emergency and a threat to life. Now, even as Iran continues to threaten international shipping and civilians in the Middle East, there are members of this body who want to create doubts about the commitments that we have to our partners on the front lines. Now, for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, this is not an abstract threat. It is their tankers that are being attacked, their airports that are being targeted, their oil fields. Now, our bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, undoubtedly, it is complicated, and we absolutely have to press for improvements in domestic human rights for both countries. I think we can agree on this wholeheartedly. We have to see justice and accountability in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, undoubtedly. And in fact, earlier this week, this body voted overwhelmingly for Mr. Malinowski's H.R. 2037, which imposes sanctions on those responsible for Mr. Khashoggi's murder. And even as the United Arab Emirates draws down its position in Yemen, we must press Saudi Arabia to minimize civilian casualties in that conflict. But none of these challenges justify whatsoever abandoning our partners as they face down a threat from an Iranian regime that is on the march throughout the Middle East. In fact, we must continue to show our investment in our strategic partnerships in order to incentivize our partners to make the changes that we are asking them to make. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have had a long-standing concern about these sales. We have codified congressional review process precisely to address such concerns. However, it is my assessment that my Democratic colleagues abused this review process. Prior to the emergency notification, Republican members had supported these sales, but Democrat members subjected them to informal holds, in some cases for over a year, without any clear path to resolution. Now, given the wide range of conflicts and threats in the Middle East, I do not understand why my colleagues were surprised when, after months and even over a year of delay, it was assessed that our partners urgently needed these defense articles and services for their national security in these emergency situations. Perhaps if my colleagues had taken a more active approach to resolving their concerns, we would have avoided this situation in which additional capabilities were needed to respond to the elevated threat, this emergency situation that has been posted by Iran. Now, Mr. Speaker, there has long been a consensus in this body that Iran's malign activities in the Middle East are a threat to the United States' national security and to our partners. In the past 3 years alone, we have passed legislation responding to Iran's support for terrorism, growing ballistic missile arsenal, and human rights abuses. The Iranian regime has not backed down from these malign activities, and it is my sincere hope that this body will not back down from its resolve to counter Iran's destabilizing agenda. Unfortunately, this resolution and the other joint resolutions of disapproval for the 22 sales are very much a step in the wrong direction. And in that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. From its inception, the Islamic Republic of Iran had an anti-American bent. What it did in our embassy, its attack on the Marines in Beirut in 1983, its efforts in Iraq. In 2003, I was part of the invasion force. I saw with my own eyes the Iranian efforts to destabilize Iraq, and they continue to do that there today. They continue to support the Assad regime in Syria. They continue to overthrow the regime in Yemen, supporting the Houthi rebels, attacking Saudi Arabia. Around the Middle East, Iran has become the enemy of freedom and democracy. If America is going to succeed, we need to have allies. We need to have friends. We need to support those allies and those friends, making sure that Saudi Arabia, UAE have the weapons that they need to fight back against Iran's terrorism and warmongering around this region is mission critical for the survival of our republic. I stand against this resolution. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Florida reserves. Gentleman from New York.
I reserve for the purpose of closing.
Gentleman reserves from New York. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the remainder of my time to close debate on this measure. I'm glad we've had a spirited debate on the issues. As always, I'm grateful to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. McCall of Texas, for his collegiality. We're generally bipartisan on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and when we do disagree, we do so on the issues and not on the politics and the personalities. I have enormous respect for Mr. Mast, which he knows about, but I would say that this today is not a referendum on Iran. I agree with everything that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have said about Iran. It's bad intentions, it's bad behavior. I agree. But again, I say, as I said before, that doesn't mean we give another country, be it an ally or not, a blank check to do whatever it pleases. And in this particular case, the conduct of the war in Yemen is just something that we cannot just turn our heads away and say, oh, well, this is the war and the Iranians are bad, so therefore we're going to look the other way. I think if we're talking about American weapons, we can demand better. So I think that these measures are a chance for the Congress to take back some of the power granted by the Constitution, to say that we won't stand by when any administration, this administration, administrations to come in both parties, we won't stand by when any administration ignores Congress, plays fast and loose with the law, and fails to demand accountability for human rights abuses around the world. I encourage all my colleagues to support this measure and the two others that we've just considered. I thank Mr. Mast and my friends on the other side of the aisle and for a spirited debate. I thank the Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired pursuant to House Resolution 491. The previous question is ordered on the joint resolution. The question is on the third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Providing for congressional disapproval of the proposed export to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland of certain defense articles and services.
The question is on the passage of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The joint resolution is passed without objection. The motion to reconsider from Florida.
That I request the yeas and nays.
The gentleman from Florida has requested the yeas and nays. Those favoring the vote by the yes and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.